Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our Harris County Master Gardeners program. I do apologize about the delay, but we are ready to go with a great program today. Today is one of my favorite ones. It is going to be kind of a grab bag, ask whatever questions that you have, open forum. So in just a minute, we'll be joined by Master Gardener Will Isbell. He's going to start with a little bit of information about finding good gardening and finding good gardening information, which is, of course, something that librarians love. It's always important to get good information and reliable information. But then after he's done with that, it's really up to you as the viewers. So please post lots of questions. Ask us whatever is on your mind about gardening. It can be for any time of the year, any plant. We're going to really see how much of an expert Will is and see what he can answer for you guys. So just before we start, I'd like to remind everybody to please like and share the program with as many people as you can. That helps us get good numbers, and it helps us continue to do the program every month. Let us know where you're watching from. We love to see where we have our viewers coming to us from. And ask lots of questions is really all I can really say. Please type them in the chat. Let us know what you would like to know, because it's your program today. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring Will on. Good morning, Will. How are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing fine. So we're going to have you go through your bit on finding good gardening information. And then once you're done, bring me back when you're ready. We'll answer some questions, and hopefully we have some good audience participation today.
Fantastic. Sounds
all right. Here
great.
You go.
All right. So good morning, everybody, and welcome again. Thanks for your patience. We had a little bit of a technical issue on my side. So we really just want to start today's talk with looking at ways of finding good gardening information. So it's great if you can call in to the Ask a Master Gardener hotline, or submit it virtually, or you have gardeners that you can ask questions to. I mean, those are all great resources, and you may need to utilize those, but really what will make you become more proficient as a gardener is spending some time researching information on your own, because you'll kind of find rabbit holes that lead to really interesting topics that you may not have even considered initially. So in the spirit of that, we're going to talk about just some general ways to separate out the good from the bad when you're looking online for answers. You know, one of the best things about living in today's society is that we walk around with our little cell phone, and it has essentially all of the world's information or access to it. The downside is there's a lot of bad information on the internet. And so finding ways to separate that out is really what we're going to be looking at today. So the first thing is, don't guess, right? Don't assume. And this goes for even experienced gardeners. It's a very common trap to just think, oh, someone said this, I know exactly what that is. This is what it is. Maybe, maybe not. So always having to gather more information before you just assume, oh, this is the solution. This is the problem. So think about that, and look for clues. You want to document details. You want to take lots of pictures. I highly recommend everyone keep a gardening journal. It does not have to be anything fancy. It can be a legal pad of paper that you keep in a drawer, by the sliding glass door. Just jot down notes, things that you're seeing in the garden, dates. If you start noticing this can be helpful. If you start noticing, let's say every May you get you have an influx of some type of caterpillar pest or grasshoppers, and you have this chronic grasshopper problem. Once you've documented a chronic grasshopper problem, then there are things you can do. There are baits that you can apply. that have very low collateral damage to any other insect, but it's only rated for situations where you have that chronic problem. So if you don't have that documented, you don't know kind of what time of year they start emerging, then you can't preemptively look for them and preemptively treat effectively. So just making sure you're documenting things, document damage to plants up close, document it from a distance so you can see the overall effect of the plant. And then we're going to look at ways to research those answers. Now, as I said, there's a ton of bad information on the internet. There's a ton of great information on the internet. And the trick is knowing how to decipher between the two. So the first place that you want to look is in university publications. These are going to be sites that end in .edu. Obviously, here in Houston area, Texas A&M University, AgriLife Extension Center are both amazing resources for us. University of Florida is also a great one. LSU is good. Clemson has some good information. Another one would be UC Davis. Now, keep in mind, the further away from Texas you get, and the more different the climate where that university is, you may have some answers or you may have some situations that don't really apply, right? You have most of the information will be fairly general and will be accurate. For instance, Florida has pests that we don't have. California has pests that we don't have, and vice versa. So you may be looking at a California guide for something and not be able to find the answer because it simply doesn't exist there. So keep that in mind. And then the last way to find answers is to reach out. And again, there are lots of local resources. Some of the mom and pop gardening centers have a tremendous amount of knowledge there. You have the Harris County Master Gardeners. You have Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. You have various gardens, and we have the Houston Botanical Garden. We have McGovern Centennial Garden, which is where I'm at a lot and volunteering in the family garden there. So we have people come by and ask us questions all the time. We have the online resource for the Ask a Master Gardener online, which is part of A&M AgriLife and Harris County Master Gardeners. It's a way to submit your questions online. For an answer, it's staffed solely by volunteers. So if you do use that, please be patient as the volunteers get in touch with you. So everybody has a tendency. So the one caveat I will say to that last part is everybody has a tendency to want to reach out and just, what's the answer? I don't want to do any work. A lot of people I understand have a garden. They don't really care about gardening. They're just, look, what can I go to the store? What can I buy? What can I spray? And 5 minutes later, 20 bucks later, 5 minutes later, my problem's solved. That's typically not going to be a great way to approach gardening. So the more reading you do on your own, the more exploring you do, the more diverse and you're going to become in your garden knowledge. So with those points in mind, we'll look at the don't assume. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind is so often people think of symptoms as the cause. Oh, my plant is wilting, or my plant has yellow leaves. That's the cause of, I have to address that. Well, it could be that you need to address a different thing that is causing that, right? That's just a symptom of something. Let's say you have a lot of weeds in your lawn. You may think, I need to treat for weeds because the weeds are the problem here. Well, quite often the weeds are only growing there because the lawn isn't growing properly. So maybe you have too much moisture in the lawn and those weeds do particularly well in a moist environment. Maybe you have a St. Augustine yard and you're keeping your turf grass cut at 1 inch, which doesn't allow it to have a deep root system, doesn't allow it to outcompete weeds around it. It doesn't allow for the 3 to 4 inches of blade length that we ideally want to see in a healthy St. Augustine turf. That also allows it to shade out germinating weed seeds around it. So, right, so the cultural aspect of how to care for that lawn is actually the way to fix the problem. But most people think of, oh, I have these weeds, I need to go to the store and I need to buy an herbicide. So I need to do a weed and feed every year. The issue is if you don't really understand what's going on and you're just assuming you understand the issue, you may inadvertently have secondary problems. For instance, if you're using a weed and feed, which is something we absolutely do not recommend using, if you have any dicot, so any broadleaf plants nearby, any trees nearby that or have their roots in that zone, they're going to be adversely affected by that herbicide. That's something you may not think about, right? So again, really need to think about this holistically and think about the macro of this, not just focusing on what got my attention first. So we've talked that kind of leads into environmental stresses often being the cause. One of the biggest thing, if you listen to nothing else I say today, which is totally fine, but the one thing I would say is just the go-to rule that I have is never treat for a problem you haven't identified, because you just don't know what you're treating for, right? You don't know how to adequately treat for it. You don't know how to treat. You may be doing something that inadvertently, like I said, has a secondary impact that is negative to the garden. For instance, let's say you use a broad spectrum pesticide. Well, spectrum pesticide may address. Let's say you have aphids on a plant, and you decide I'm going to go buy Sevin Dust and I'm going to spray this with Sevin, and that's how I'm going to treat. You'll knock out most of the aphid population. There's going to be some left over just because they have a good tolerance for many pesticides. What you will absolutely wipe out is all of your beneficials. And so the beneficials are there to help keep those aphids in check. So if you wipe out all the beneficials, when that small pest population that survives starts procreating, then you're going to have this population that blooms and it gets out of hand very quickly because you have no natural predators there to keep those populations in check. So that's one of the things you need to be aware of. If you're not sure what the problem is, simply don't treat for it. There are some ways to narrow down the possibilities, which is what you want to do, right? We go out in the garden, it's very confusing. There are 1,000 things out there that are looking to chew up your garden. And if we can narrow that down to just 100, well, then that saves us a lot of time in looking for answers. So if you see that if your concern is that your leaves have been chewed on, well, then we know it's something that can eat leaves. Like it's something that physically chews leaves. That narrows the insect world down to just a handful of insects that are kind of the common problems. They're going to have a chewing mouth part. It could be snails. It could also be some kind of rodent, squirrel population, or maybe even rabbits or something like that. If you see that the leaves have just turned black, well, then we can look at common causes of that, right? We can look at fungal issues, something like sooty mold. We can look at fire blight. Maybe there was a recent frost and this is just dieback from that. So again, we do want to look for ways to narrow the possibilities. And then there are some things that happen frequently. So a lot of people get concerned when they see, for instance, webbing on something. So spider mite webbing, which you can see here in the upper right corner, first of all, we can tell that this is spider mite because we can look at the leaves and see all this little tiny dots of stippling damage, right? That in combination with the webbing and depending on the type of plant it's on indicates that this is spider mite. This is something that's going to negatively affect our plant. And at that point, we can assess, do we need to treat for this? Or is this a plant that going into the spider mite season, which is when it's dry and hot, which is right where we are right now, going into the spider mite season, our plant was super healthy and it can probably just push through. Yes, it's not going to look the greatest then, but don't need to really treat. It'll push through. It'll be fine when things cool down a bit or we get some more moisture, which discourages spider mite populations. That's a perfectly acceptable treatment not to treat. You also may see webbing like the picture on the bottom. We get a lot of calls about that every year, a lot of emails about it. This is just bark lice. The webbing will happen on the trunk of a tree, quite often oak trees, or you'll see these. It's massive quantities of webbing often. And it's very alarming for people because they think, oh gosh, something is attacking my tree, or they think there's a fungal issue or something. This is just a tiny little bark lice. They're in there. They're actually beneficial. They're helping clean up organic matter in between the bark, and so they're going to do their thing. They have the webbing when their population is large. As they get everything cleaned up, the webbing will drop away as their populations decline, and they'll move on to other areas. So, kind of deciphering between things, looking for those ways to narrow down the population, and then you really need to ask lots and lots of questions. This is just a list of some basic questions that are helpful. What type of plant is it? How old is it? Some plants just have a plant life. So if you have a 30-year-old plant, it may not there may not be something wrong and that you can treat for. It may just be that the plant has reached the end of its life cycle, and it's just the natural course that it's going to slowly decline. How many plants are symptomatic? Do you have a single plant that's problematic, or do you have, is your entire bed displaying symptoms? What are those symptoms? How long has it been showing those? Ideally, we want to be assessing situations on the front side of symptoms rather than waiting. Oh, well, yeah, I noticed that about 2 months ago, but I went on vacation and then came back and it was a lot worse. So keeping a close monitor. If you notice something, it doesn't mean you have to have a hair trigger and treat for it, right? You don't. I'm not necessarily saying that. What I'm saying is, if you notice something in the yard, okay, take note of it, write it in your journal, keep an eye on it. And as soon as that starts getting to the point, and maybe you're even doing research at that point to find out if I have to treat, what is causing this, and if I have to treat, where are my thresholds? Are there any established thresholds for treatment? In other words, are there any, like for grubs, people will see that they have grub worms in their yard and they think, oh gosh, grub worms will destroy my lawn. I must treat for them. No, there's actually a threshold of how many grubs exist in a square foot before you need to actually consider treatment. Outside of that, it's contraindicated. So keeping track of how long it's shown the symptoms and what those are will be helpful to you. Also, a lot of things that people don't think about are chemical questions. Right? Have you sprayed pesticides on it recently? Has your lawn company sprayed pesticides on it recently? And a lot of people, I find, aren't really aware of what their lawn company or their pest company is actually spraying and why. And that's something you should talk to your lawn company, you should talk to your pest control company, and they should have a plan. They should identify, this is why we are spraying, this is what we are treating, this is following IPM guidelines, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Following IPM guidelines, we're starting at this level of treatment because it's the safest level, and we're not going to escalate until something presents itself that would indicate a need for a more substantial treatment. When was the last time you fertilized? What type of fertilizer did you use? If you're using a synthetic fertilizer, which is okay to use, you do need to know that it's very easy to burn roots with a synthetic fertilizer. And so if you didn't get the dilution rate correct, or you put out too much of it, then that could potentially be a problem. Looking at watering questions. So quite often, watering can be an issue. And so thinking about, is there too much moisture in the yard? Is there do I have adequate draining? What's the irrigation schedule? Maybe it's going off too much. Maybe it's not going off enough, and your plants are getting stressed for that reason. Maybe it's going off the wrong time of day. What time does your irrigation system go off? You may be developing fungal issues because your water system is going off at 1 a.m. and your plants are essentially sitting with wet leaves until after the dew point, right? So that's typically discouraged in horticulture. You want your watering irrigation system to kick on after the dew point. Like 4 to 6 a.m. is ideal because the sun comes out, it dries those leaves off. minimizes any standing water on the leaves, which in our area really promotes fungal issues. Is there a drip line nearby? Was there some treatment on a roof that might be running off? Have you mulched lately? What type of mulch material were you using? So these are all things that you need to think about, and approach this just like you would your own health, because what we're talking about is the health of your garden. Really think about, is there anything that has changed? Are there any parameters to the garden that have changed recently, maybe in the 6 weeks prior to you noticing the issue? Because those often will be potential smoking guns that we can look at. Is the bark intact? Is grass away from the trunk? It's very common for trees to get damaged when the grass grows right up to them, because the weed eaters strike the trunk and cause scarring, which can then prevent a problem with them getting nutrients up and down the trunk. What's the depth of the mulch? In the picture that you see here, this is definitely going to lead to issues with this tree, and the tree is going to have a slow decline after a while, because the mulch is too high up the side of the trunk, and so it's going to trap moisture there. It's going to allow for a lot of decay in that area, so that's a big no-no. But it's something that's very common. You see it all the time when I'm driving around. Again, it's something, and a lot of those are not situations created by homeowners. A lot of those are lawn companies that have done that. So if you're a homeowner and you're not aware of what your lawn company is doing, there may be some problems from that. Again, we talked about this a little bit. You want to take multiple pictures. You want close-ups, and you want some with a little distance. You can take 10. My rule of thumb is, if there's something I really want to get a good picture of, is I take probably 5 of them, and then I go back and I find the one that is the best and keep that and delete the others. Blurry pictures won't help with identification. Something up close, something far back will help when you're trying to identify something online. And often a sense of scale is nice. Rulers, of course, are great, but you have to put them in the same plane as the subject matter. If they're in front or behind, then it distorts how large or small they actually appear. If you have some insect problem and you think you need to send in a sample, then you can look. The general rule of thumb is crunchy things that if you pinch them and squish them, they would crunch. They go in a container, that's fine. If you pinch them and they would squish, then you should put those in a little jar of alcohol, a little bottle of alcohol, and that will help preserve them until they can be identified. Again, blurry pictures, and this is kind of a comical image, but we get these all the time of, hey, what is this? And actually, the petals in the back here are going to make this much more easy to identify what it is than the one that they were actually taking the picture of. This is great, but it would help to have something in there to determine scale. This is actually, we would know exactly what that is, but a lot of caterpillars, scale is important. Again, use something that's a common object. I've actually had someone send me where they put their driver's license in the picture, which was handy on the fact that I know exactly how I can take out my driver's license in Texas and measure it. I know exactly how big their driver's license was. I've had people send credit cards that way, so maybe don't do that unless you also sign a release that I can go shopping with that card number. But if you put it too far in front, then it will distort again. So keep that in mind. It has to be in the same plane as the subject matter. Then the next thing we're going to talk about is just researching your answer. So this is where you've collected all your data, you've collected all your your clues to solve this mystery, and now you're going to roll up your sleeves and hit the internet and look for your answers. So research-based information, ideally provided by universities, is always going to be your first source to look for. Again, there's just a lot of bad information out there. There's a lot of unsubstantiated information out there. IPM is something that if you're not familiar with and you have an insect issue, you definitely, it's integrated pest management is what it stands for. It's definitely something that you want to familiarize yourself with. It's actually very common sense based. It's essentially, summing up the old adage of don't bring a gun to a knife fight, right? If you can handle something with a mildly toxic or a very targeted pesticide first, well, don't use a broad spectrum to treat that issue. Handle it in the most responsible way that isn't going to that's going to minimize the collateral damage to other organisms in the yard. This is we get a lot of recommendations of, oh well, my grandmother used to do this. My grandmother used to do a lot of things in the garden that looking back on, I'm somewhat appalled at. Like, I mean, my job growing up in gardening with her was we had a malathion dust, right? And I would hold that little dust can and she would point to a plant, and man, I would dust that thing until it looked like a flocked Christmas tree. Now, in hindsight, I also didn't have a mask on and was probably inhaling a great amount of that dust because I was 5 and I'm sure I was shaking it literally up and down instead of just on the plant. It's also something that would have had a fairly lengthy residual. It would have knocked out every bit of the beneficial insect population there. So again, just because something is cheaper, just because something is the way that it's been done for a long time, doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to do it. So, where we run into home remedies a lot are like, oh, insecticidal soap. No, you don't need to go buy insecticidal soap. Just take some dish soap, squish it in a spray bottle, fill it up with water, and spray your leaves. Well, the issue with that is what were they using? What soap were they using? you know, an ounce of Dawn isn't necessarily comparable to an ounce of Palmolive, isn't necessarily comparable to an ounce of something that is super concentrated, right? Um, and also, those soaps have not been tested on plant tissue. So the reason to go buy the insecticidal soap is it's working with a fatty acid soap that has been tested on plant tissue. So we know what the toxicity level of plant tissue is. We know what the temperature restrictions are. And so we can use that in a responsible way with very little chance that there is going to be damage outside of these set parameters, right? So that's what you want. It's replicated results. And again, home remedies are kind of all over the board, and oftentimes they're just not effective. They may seem effective, right? It can be tricky because, growing up, my grandfather used to, if they had an ant problem, he was in at the tea kettle boiling that water. He'd take it out, he'd pour it on there, he'd break it open and put an orange peel in, and then the ants were gone. And in his mind, killed all the ants, solved the problem. Well, the ants weren't gone, the ants just moved. And so he didn't really solve the problem. He just shifted the problem, at best case scenario to his neighbor's yard, a worst case scenario somewhere else in his yard. And so he'll think, oh, I fixed this problem. I don't have to worry about it anymore. But it wasn't actually addressed. So you need to kind of be mindful of situations like that. Extension publications, again, we talked about University of Florida, LSU, UC Davis, Clemson's another good one, of course, A&M AgriLife Extension, and A&M University are great. Another reminder that you're going to try and stick with universities that have a similar climate with similar issues to us here in the Houston Gulf Coast area. So AgriLife does have entomologists. You can send specimens. We have a plant disease lab, and you can submit specimens to that. And I'll provide a link in a bit that has a sheet that has all these websites on it. You can always reach out to the county extension agents or the master gardeners here. You can network with other master gardeners. You can network again with often the mom and pop stores have very knowledgeable people working for them, those nurseries. So those can often be a great resource of some place to look for. The soil testing, if you need to have your soil tested, A&M has a place that can do that. And then the plant disease laboratory that I talked about, there's the website for that, but there's a linkable PDF that we have for you that will make that easier to find. And then these are just some other websites. We're going to cover some of these in a bit, so I won't go through them too much here. So some key search engines, everybody has their favorite. I use Google a lot just because it's I'm a Chrome person, and so it's what naturally comes up on my computer. There are some things to think about. There are advanced searches that you can use. You can use quotes as a way of creating a phrase that it reads as a locked phrase. So if there's, if you remember, oh, I remember reading this publication and it had this phrase in it. Maybe you search the subject and then put that phrase in quotes. Now, the downside about that is you have to have it exactly right, because it's going to, anything between those quotations, it's going to read as a single search query. Plus signs, minus signs, plus signs before a word will generate more that actually have that word in them. In the query, minus signs will remove that. So let's say you wanted to read up on monarch in butterflies, but there's a monarch pest control near you, and so they're coming up in the results. Well, you can type minus pest control, and it will take that pest control company. Most of those will pop out of your query results, so that can be a way to narrow down your search to things that are more targeted to what you're trying to find. One of my favorites, and this is a great way to find educational information, is to type after you type whatever your search parameters are, you type cite:\sign.edu, and it will pull universities. It will pull only things using that terminate in that edu. So those are going to be all the educational universities. If there's a specific one that you want to do, then like let's say you wanted it to be from A&M, then you would do cite:\temu.edu. Image searches can also be very helpful. Now, you have to keep in mind that just because someone online somewhere said, typed an identification under an image, doesn't necessarily mean it's a correct identification. Again, image searches can help narrow down, can help indicate, oh, here's an identification that you may want to search for and verify that. All right, so that's the end of that. Brian, if you don't mind popping up the web link that I gave you.
Mm-hmm. I can put that in right now for you. And we have some good questions coming up too. Whenever you're ready,
okay,
just let me know and we can read them out for you. So I just posted your Google Drive link.
So the Google Drive link is going to, so I'm going to cover this really quickly so we can get to some questions. The Google Drive link is going to take you.
Let me know when you're ready to put your screen back up.
Give me 1 second.
Finding good information.
All right, you can throw my screen back up.
Here we go. Perfect. There we go.
So the Google Drive link is going to take you to this folder online. You can go ahead and download any of these that you want. There is a fire ant control that talks about, this is just indicating there's a 2-step process. It does not go into what that process is. This is really just to illustrate, depending on the area that you're trying to treat, there are certain chemicals that you can use. You can't use in the vegetable garden things that you can use on your lawn necessarily. So keep that in mind. If you look at the website references, this will be the search online tips. This is going to pull up. This is going to pull up the things I just talked about, right? And so that can be very helpful to read through as a reminder. This is a basic IPM. So if you're not familiar with IPM, this will walk you through kind of the basic tenets of that. And then the most useful and the one I would keep handy is the website references. And these are divided by topic. And you're going to be hard pressed to find a topic that isn't covered somewhere on this. So from plant selectors, so you're not sure what to plant, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is a great place to ID different wildflower species that are here in the Houston and throughout Texas. The vegetable gardening, of course, we have a lot of people always interested in that. There's trees, turf, butterfly gardening. There are a lot of different entomology. Obviously, that's kind of one of my specialties. And so there are probably more of those than any other links just because it's the one I'm the most familiar with. But this should be definitely something to go to and look at. And then there's also some websites for specific plant resources. These are going to be a lot of the different plant-specific societies, so like the Begonia Society or the Orchid Society. And those can be great resources of information. Just keep in mind that no matter where you're getting the information from, have a skeptical mindset of what you're reading. And then I like to always verify that information at an independent site that is different than the one I found my original information from. So for instance, if I'm on Texas A&M and I find a site, I may go to University of Florida and verify that information. And that always helps me know that yes, that's actual, that's an accurate thing. Sometimes they'll talk about different applications of that, so it will broaden your understanding of something that the first publication only touched on. But all right, with that said, I think we can pop right into some questions.
Yeah, we have some good ones and a little bit of a variety here. The first one is...
So you can take my screen down if you want, Brian. Yeah.
I'll just be chatting for a little bit. So I have a Purple Beauty bell pepper plant this year. It's grown beautifully and set its first pepper. It's grown to about a golf ball size, then started turning from green to purple black. Should I let it continue to grow or pull it once it's finished turning purple or black?
So keep in mind that pepper size can depend on a couple of things. So it can depend on where in the season it is. Typically, peppers grown at the front end of the season are going to be a little larger. Their plants are going to be a little more productive. As we get into the heat, you're going to start seeing pepper sizes decline. They're going to get smaller and smaller. Certainly, that's true of eggplants. And it also matters how many fruits were on that branch. So, if you talk to a rosarian, they're experts on this concept because they're growing that one rose that's going to win them the blue ribbon, right? So let's say their rose plant has four blooms on a single stalk, on a single stem. Each of those is sharing the nutrients that the plant is providing. So the nutrients is being split between 4 different blooms. What they'll do is they'll go in, they'll pick the best one, and they'll trim the others off. And then that single bloom gets all the nutrients from that stem and gets bigger and better than it ever would have been sharing with nutrients with its brothers and sisters. This is the reason that on fruit trees, thinning is an important concept. So you have to go in and you have to thin out so that you only have so many peaches per limb. You have so many apples per limb. It's to ensure that you're going to have a good quality crop. So one thing to look at is, you'll see sometimes with pepper plants, they're very abundant, but you need to kind of go in and snip some off. Assuming that it is just growing under normal conditions, it should be, a Purple Beauty should be, at least 4 to 5 inches long. Sometimes they do mature quickly. So once it reaches its full size or final color, you can leave it on there a little bit, see if it'll get any bigger, but certainly you can always pull it and eat it. It'll have the same flavor as long as it's matured. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. What is a good 8 to 12 foot evergreen plant or small tree that doesn't shed, that would add beauty and interest near a pool, not be too thirsty, take part sun, and not shed a lot of stuff that would blow into the pool? And bonus points for a bloomer.
So you want the holy grail of trees, is what I'm
the
understanding.
perfect tree. Yeah. What's the best tree?
I think there are lots of trees that can fit that parameter. And so one of the, again, I'll give you a couple of answers, but one of the things I would send you to is if you go to that list of websites that we've provided, you'll find actually this one may not be on there. So Brian, if you'll do a quick search for Texas tree selector.
Okay, yeah, because the
you'll
gardeners posted
find that link. If you'll throw that in the comment section, that can be a useful link. Treesaregood.org can be a great place to look for tree references or resources too. And the Texas tree selector is one of my favorites because you can actually type in everything that you've just specified here. You can say, I want it to be evergreen. I want it to be this size. It's going to need, relatively dry conditions, and they'll send back a result of all the trees that fit those parameters. So I would say in a situation like that, you could look at a little gem. The problem is that, when you're talking about trees at 8 to 12 feet, what you're really probably wanting is almost even a shrub at that point. If it's getting, because, trees, even if they, like a little gem is a tiny, and they say, oh, it's going to top out at 10 to 12 feet, but it's not uncommon to see things that are, the problem is that plants don't read the books that tell them how big they should grow. And so often in the right condition, something that should have stopped at 10 feet, I've had a dwarf hedge get 10, 12 feet tall. Well, it's a dwarf. It was supposed to stop at 3 feet. It had no idea, so it just kept going. You could look at, for that, you could, like a viburnum would be really nice. Like a Walters viburnum makes a really beautiful little hedge shaped tree that is evergreen. It gives you some great blooms in the spring and gives you some berries that the birds are going to enjoy as well. For evergreen, you're going to be looking at, I think one of the small magnolias could be nice, but it needs to not be, when I say magnolia, I'm not talking about what we commonly here call a tulip tree, because that's going to be a deciduous variety of magnolia. I'm talking about something like a little gem or something in that range that would be good. But yeah, but looking at that Texas tree selector, they're going to throw tons of options at you. And you can go from there.
Perfect. And I'm going to actually skip a question and go right to another one because I think we just touched on it. Are Vitex and Viburnum considered invasive?
So that's a tricky question, and it depends a lot on who you ask and how big a purist they are with what is native and what is adaptive. Again, so if you were just a hardcore native plant person, like nothing that wasn't here, 300 years ago before people got, then you'd pretty much just have grasses in your front yard. We're a coastal grassland. We have some trees are indigenous to this area, but certainly as we move more to the coast from East Texas, it becomes more grass oriented. To me, I'm a little bit more lenient in what I consider a lot of adaptive plants. Okay, my rule of thumb is I look at this. Is it going to reproduce rapidly in our environment and outcompete other plants? If that's the case, then for me, it's a plant I tend to avoid. So I've done a fair amount of reading on Vitex, and I'm okay. Now this is a very divisive topic. So I'm sure there's going to be some comments on this, Brian. I am okay with planting Vitex in Houston. Now, if we were in Austin, I would not, because in Austin, in a drier climate, a more rocky climate, they're evidently more prone to propagating and spreading. In our climate, they seem to be more mild-mannered, more controlled, and so something like that, I'm okay. Viburnum, that's a huge category of plants. There are tons of different viburnums, so it would depend on what viburnum you were talking about. The Walters viburnum I've planted. I've never ever seen it come up anywhere else around it. It does have seed pods, so theoretically it should be coming up nearby. I've never had an issue with it. But again, it could have just been the places that I had it. So I think it really depends on the place. For instance, I also have some people think of things as invasive just because they do really well. Like at McGovern Centennial Gardens, we planted, because we wanted to support some butterfly life, we planted some of the maypops, the passion flower vines. And I think it stressed some gardeners out because they were like, no, we don't put this in because it'll be everywhere. But it's a really good location for it because we have it in an isolated area. And arguably you could say, well, yeah, but it's native to the area. So if it got out, it's not a big deal, other than the fact that they're trying to keep a very specific aesthetic there, and they may have to weed it. It's surrounded by crushed granite. And so it's probably not going to spread as readily as it would in, say, a forest, a woodland setting. Now, that said, I did notice this year, for the first time in 3 years, there is a little tiny one coming up about 3 feet away in the middle of the crushed granite where everybody walks. I don't know how it is coming up in that compacted of soil. So it's a hardy little plant. So the term invasive is a very relative term, but to answer the question simply, I'm okay with Vitex in the Houston area, and the viburnum just depends on which type of viburnum it is.
All right. Sometimes the smaller questions have a lot of answers to it.
Well, the reality is any question I answer has a lot.
That's also
probably
very
too
true.
many answers.
But I think that's why we enjoy this program. Okay, so moving on.
And there, I see there's one about treating aphids.
That was I was just about to read that. Yeah.
So
do you want me to read it to you, or do you have it there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what is the most effective method to treat aphids? It seems that each summer at this time, my Confederate rose is inundated with aphids. You recommend neem oil?
So aphids. So aphids can be tricky, because when aphids do something more akin to cloning than traditional reproduction. So when an aphid is born, it can actually be pregnant already with the next generation. So their populations can explode quite quickly. The good news is they're fairly easy to treat. They pretty much have to consistently feed. So a strong stream of water to blow them off the leaves. Now, you don't want to be blowing them onto other plants, right? That's not going to solve your problem. But if you can blow them off onto the ground, that can be an effective way. Obviously, on a rose, hosing down the leaves on a regular basis may have other issues with fungus, fungal problems and things. You should be seeing a lady beetle population move in. If you're not, I would look at if you're treating broad spectrum pesticides anywhere in your yard. If you are, then of course that's going to knock out your lady beetle population. They will come in and help manage that, but only once those aphid populations are substantial. Aphids will also do something where, when they get too crowded on a plant, or the current population is too large, the next generation will be a winged generation, so that they can then fly and disperse and spread the party around. So neem oil and insecticidal soap will absolutely work on treating aphids. If you're going to treat, I would inspect the plant thoroughly. I use insecticidal soap predominantly to treat aphids. You need to inspect the plant thoroughly and assess whether there are any beneficial insects on it. And if there are, then you may want to postpone treatment to give them a chance to move in. And because if you spray them with neem oil or insecticidal soap, it is going to kill them. The only trick with neem oil this time of year is you really need to look out for if the temperature restrictions, and that goes for even horticultural soap. The good thing is horticultural soap tends to be to wear off very quickly. So it's a target pesticide, or it's a physical contact pesticide. So if you don't actually spray, It doesn't have a residual. So if something walks across the leaf that you sprayed and you didn't actually spray that organism, it's not going to harm it. The other trick with treating aphids is once you commit to treatment, you have to commit. So it's treatment, wait 7 to 10 days, second treatment, wait 7 to 10 days, third treatment. If you do not do the repeated treatments and you do not have your timing correct, then you cannot effectively control the population, and you're going to get into this cycle of just constantly having to treat, which is not what you want to do. You want to hit it appropriately, and then stop. So go ahead and set an alarm in your phone so that you know when the next treatment is due. You definitely, anything blooming, you don't treat. Trying to avoid treating anytime bees are active, or if you can't avoid that, just ensure you're not, you're not spraying any of the actual bees. There shouldn't be, again, much of a residual on the plant after that.
Okay. This is a little bit of an in-depth one. So we have an older magnolia tree, 50 plus years, that was in distress due to scale, lack of topsoil, and not being watered on a regular basis. We've treated it for scale and have done deep watering for 3 weekends in a row. We now want to add topsoil 1 inch per our arborist. We also plan on growing Asian jasmine around the base and out to the tree line. How much topsoil should we add to make sure the Asian jasmine can grow?
Okay, so I guess one thing I would want to know is, how did you treat it for scale? Because that's going to, scale is not easy to treat for, and it's certainly not easy to treat for on magnolias always. So something else, and again, I'm not saying there's right or wrong in any of this. Well, I guess there are some rights or wrongs, but in this conversation, it's pretty mundane. This is a common concept that comes up, and you can find a balance, but it's sometimes tricky to do. So what everybody wants is, they want 3 to 4 trees in the yard that are beautiful, mature trees, right? And then they want plant life underneath them that's super happy. And the problem with that is, if you go out in a forest, everybody wants their lawn to go right up to the base of the tree, or they want a ton of other plant life under there. So when you go out in a forest and you see these trees, you look at the forest floor, it often doesn't have a ton of plants in it, right? Certainly it's not going to have any grasses growing there. You go out to a pasture with grasses, and you're not going to see a ton of trees, because they compete for the same resource there. And so what I would do in a situation like that is, you have to decide, if you're going to grow something right under that tree, you do have to understand that they're going to, to some degree, they're going to be competing for the same resources. Now, it could be that you're able to supplement those resources, the nutrients and the moisture that are required, in abundance, so that both plants can be happy. There is still going to be a spatial issue, right? So people think about trees as having these super deep roots, and that's where they send all of that's where they get all of their nutrients from. The reality is that trees pull most of their nutrients and moisture from the top 8 inches of soil. That's the same place that most ornamentals pull their nutrients and moisture from. So there is going to be some competition, because you have a finite amount of room in the top 8 inches of soil for roots and things like that, right? So now, that said, so you can decide. A great way that I often recommend for having plants underneath trees is to look at containers, and have glazed containers or containers of some sort that you set on a paver. So set a paver down, put the container on that, or else the roots are going to go straight through the container into the ground. And that can give you pops of color, and you can have some plant life there that gives you some visual interest, without necessarily having to put something in the ground that is competing with that for those resources. And so if you've treated for scale, keep in mind too, trees don't decline quickly, and trees don't show stress quickly. Trees are a long game. So often people will say, oh, well, yeah, the mower nicked the bottom of the tree, but that was last year and it still looks good, so it's fine. Maybe, maybe not. I have a tree in my esplanade right now that was a gorgeous oak tree until a delivery truck came down and took probably a 12-inch limb off of it. And now it stripped the bark at the trunk. That starts a timer. There is nothing that can be done to save that tree. It's not a matter of if that tree will die, it's a matter of when that tree is going to die. So when we think about trees, we need to be thinking long term, right? Not in the short term. So let me just look up something.
And they do respond. They use Dominion per our arborist for scale.
Okay, so Dominion is a systemic pesticide. So it's imidacloprid is the active ingredient in Dominion, and that has pros and cons. I would, if you're not going to be able to do this because your magnolia tree is probably quite large. The reason systemics are often used to help treat scale is because scale form a waxy covering over them, and it protects them when you go to spray them with pesticide. It sits on the waxy coating. It doesn't actually get to the insect underneath. And so it makes it very difficult to treat for. So often people will treat using a systemic pesticide, which is absorbed into the plant tissue. And then if you can imagine, this is your tree trunk, this is your scale on the outside, right? It's feeding out of inside the tree trunk, right? And so it's sucking up the insecticide from the tissue of the plant. Now, the downside about things like imidacloprid, and again, I'm not going to villainize any pesticide. I'm going to say imidacloprid is probably way overused in horticulture. And there are adverse effects because that pesticide is also present in the pollen and the nectar when the plant blooms. And oftentimes it takes a long time for it to move out of the system of the plant. So, but the reason they're not using an oil or something like that, well, certainly not, you're not using oil right now because it's way too hot. It's also very difficult to treat a huge tree, right? Depending on what type of magnolia this is. This could be a substantial, you could be talking about a 25, 30 foot tall tree. That's really hard to effectively use spray on. And so if that has been treated, I would discourage the plant. I would knock off any blooms that you can for the next 6 months after treatment. You'll have to contact your arborist and ask them about how long that will be active in the plant tissue. They should have a good idea of that. So you can't, when you're talking about adding soil on top of an existing level. So let's just say this is your level of soil and this is your tree, growing out. I wish I had a little whiteboard here. You do not want, the trunk is going to have what's called the trunk flare, and it's where, we'll pretend that this green box is the ground. Well, let's see if I can, right. So the trunk is going to flare out like this. You do not want to cover up that root flare. So if that root flare is already at the ground, then you don't want to add a whole bunch of soil on top of that, because what you're going to end up doing is smothering your tree. You can add an inch or two gradually, but this notion that you're going to throw 6 to 8 inches of topsoil down and then plant in that is going to adversely affect the health of your tree. And if you have a tree that's already stressed out, you really don't want to do that. So I would potentially, especially when you have a situation where your tree is already stressed, I would probably hold off on planting anything under it, because you don't want to do anything that's going to further stress this tree out, right? And I think one of the things you need to identify is, and you can talk to your arborist about this, was the scale. It's very common for magnolia to have the little false oleander scale. It's a little white scale here in Houston. It's not atypical. Was the scale infestation bad enough, that heavy enough that it was the cause of the stress of the tree? Or is there something else going on around that tree that is distressing the tree? So you need to, don't assume just because my tree was stressed and I saw scale that there's a causal link between those two. There may not be. That may be coincidence, that they just both happen to occur at the same time. So you should work with your arborist to ensure that that was 100%, or that he's at least or she is relatively certain that that was the cause of the stress to the tree. If not, that's when you need to look at, you know, are you is there a lot of compaction nearby the tree, or is anyone driving cars over that area? Is there a lot of even just pedestrian foot traffic over that area? Is the tree landlocked by concrete, so it has kind of reached the extent of how far it can grow, and maybe there's some girdling going on with the roots, all of which have some remedies, right? But my advice is to hold off on playing the jasmine. Don't assume that the scale was the source of distress until you really talk to the arborist. And again, you would have to have a lot of scale on that tree. It would be visible. You'd probably have a ton of sooty mold on the tree, so you'd notice a lot of black leaves that when you lick it or wet your finger and rub it, the black comes off. That grows on the sugar that's produced in the honeydew that those insects excrete. So.
Okay. So, it's a little after 12, but I really wanted to hit the one question that we had chatted about earlier. If you still have time.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I'm used to 2-hour lectures, so I'll stay on as long as people are tuned in. Yeah.
But I think we'd really like to talk a little bit about how to help protect our lawns and plants through this massive heat wave that we're getting. I'm sure we've all recognized it's a little bit warm outside. So any general tips that you can give us throughout
It's a little warm. We're in the middle of a micro drought that they're predicting for at least in the Houston area for the next 3 to 4 weeks. We're going to be back up in the hundreds here at the end of the weekend. And we just celebrated first day of summer yesterday, so it's a hot one. There are absolutely some things to think about. So the first is ensuring that you have the right place and the right plant, or the right plant in the right place, right? Don't further stress a plant by giving it too much sun exposure or too little sun exposure. For your lawn, something that you will have to work, and I will tell you right now, even my lawn company, we go back and forth about this all the time. They finally have, we switched to a new service and they're fantastic. So they've agreed to do what I'm asking. They may not do it to any other house that they work on, but they do it on mine. Is you want a healthy blade length on it. So we happen to have St. Augustine, and so you want you want to maintain that at the highest, and they're going to have to set the mower at the very highest setting. So you want to mow frequently. You don't want to be taking off more than a quarter to a third of the blade length at any one time. That'll help decrease thatch. You want a healthy blade length, because that's going to give you the length of the grass blade is proportionate to the depth of the root system. So you have a shallow 1 inch tall lawn, you're going to have a shallow root system because there's a correlation in how they support each other, right? So a longer blade length is going to give you a deeper root system, which is going to help every time you water be more effective. I would say everybody should be mulching. If you haven't mulched your area, mulch. That will help reduce evaporative loss of moisture from your soil. It's good to go ahead and audit your irrigation system if you have one, and make sure that you don't have any broken sprinklers. Also, go out while it's actively spraying. Make sure it's not overspraying on the sidewalks. You're not wasting water. Texas is beginning to learn something that California has been dealing with for a long time, which is, water is a scarce resource, and we've been able to take that for granted because we often get a ton of rainfall here and we don't really have water issues, but increasingly we're starting to deal with that like everyone else in the country. So, you want to ensure that you're not wasting water. That includes runoff. So if you see that you run your irrigation and it's running off into the street, then you're running your cycle too long. It could be, and then also after you run your cycle, take a little trowel and stick it in the lawn, stick it in the garden bed, and pull back and look how deeply that water has penetrated the soil. You ideally want, probably a 4 to 6 inch penetration of that moisture after, say, 30 minutes to an hour. And if you don't have that, or if you're noticing runoff before you achieve proper penetration of water in the soil, then what you may want to do is set your system to run a short time. And certainly lawns that are sloped in the, like a lot of front lawns and that have a slope in them have this issue. You have to run the irrigation for a short duration, let that soak in, then run it for a short duration, let that soak in, wait 30 minutes, run it again, let that soak in. If you try and do it all at once, the ground can only absorb so much water at a time and it runs the rest off. Make sure that you're keeping your plants as healthy as possible. So not letting them get stressed between waterings. Consistent moisture is important. It keeps them from, if you're letting them wilt every time before you water again, often that is going to stress the plants out, and it's going to stress plants actually attract pest insects often. So that's something to keep in mind. Not overwatering lawns. That's a very common problem. Your lawn on average needs about 1 inch of rain a week. It doesn't need to be watered every day. It is better to water plants less often and deeply to encourage deep root development than less often or than more frequently and shallow waterings that doesn't develop deep roots, and so they're not going to be very resistant in drought conditions. Certainly that is true of the lawn. You probably don't need to water your lawn. In fact, I can say you don't need to water your lawn more than one good water a week, likely, unless you have some decreased depth of soil issue or there's something else going on. The couple ways to know if you have St. Augustine, which I think is probably one of the most common in Houston, when about 1/3 of the blades have folded closed, that's when it's a good visual cue that you should water. Another way is if you walk through the yard and after a couple of minutes, the blades don't spring back up and you can kind of see your footprint in them. That can be an indication that it's time to water. So yeah, don't get carried away and assume just because it's hot, I'm going to go out every day and water. Now, if you have container plants, that is definitely something you're going to need to think about. If you have containers that are in full sun and they're terracotta, you may want to try and move those to a shadier location because they're going to lose a lot of moisture through the walls, through evaporative loss when they heat up in the sun. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, hopefully we can get through it. I hope it doesn't stay too hot for too long, but I don't have any high hopes for that one.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. We have next month on July 19th, our Green Thumb presentation is fall vegetable gardening, one of my favorites because I do like to eat all of the plants that we can grow if possible. Please join us for that. And don't forget, you can view any of our older Master Gardeners videos. They're all on our Facebook page. They are on the Harris County Public Library YouTube page. And I believe that they're also on the Harris County Master Gardeners Facebook page. So as we've been doing these for the last few years, we're just saving them all as an archive. You can go back and view any of the programs that we've done, get the information. And I think that's pretty much everything. So Will, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, you bet. One thing I will say is that link is on the, Brian sent that link out for those documents. They will not exist in that folder forever. So I would probably go and if you would like to download those, which certainly the IPM and the Finding Good Information Online and the helpful resources are the three that I would recommend the most, then I would do that maybe in the next 2 to 4 weeks.
And that's going to be the Google Drive that we posted. I'll post
the Google Drive, yeah.
So you can grab that. So yeah, go ahead and grab that now. That way you have it on your own. And we will see you all next month for vegetable gardening. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, I think